Hi, my name is Christo. I'm terribly sorry for being late. Arrived late last night and couldn't find my way to here, which blemishes my reputation of being able to find spies around the world. But at least they can't find me either, so that's good. I'm one of the members of the Bellingcat team, and I was in charge of the investigation that identified and disclosed several senior GRU spies and their spy masters in some cases. It all started with the Skripal investigation, and I'll focus on the chronology and genesis of how that went about today. I'll show you some insight into how the Bellingcat team worked on that, with screenshots from the actual in-house platform where we collaborate and cooperate that nobody else has seen before. And then I'll talk about the actual identification process. I will have a second speech tomorrow where I will focus on some of the data tools and the tools that we used in identification of these, but also some other spies. Something that is important to say from the beginning is that there's no standard procedure for identifying spies because it's an actual evolving game. It's something like a computer game where the first time you do it, you complete level 1, but the other party then adjusts their own methods and their own protection, and it becomes level 2. And then when you publish the second investigation in the second round, it becomes level 3. And in this particular case, the levels were very clear, and we could see, and at some point we started anticipating what the other party, which in this case was the Russian government or the Russian Ministry of Defense, was going to do to make it more difficult and to take it to the next level. So I'll talk about these levels as we go along, but importantly, it's a heuristic model. You have to adjust, you have to think like them, you have to try to think like them and develop a new method with every new investigation. So how did it all start? Well, it started with an appeal by the Metropolitan Police on September 5th, 2018, which I'm sure all of you have seen or have heard about. The counterterrorism police released images of 2 suspects in connection with the Salisbury attack. As any news that has crime in it or especially spies with it, the whole Bellingcat team jumped on this, went online and started looking at what this gives us. And basically there was very little that was given to the public. One was that there was an approximate age range of 40 years old. They're Russian nationals traveling on Russian passports, most likely under aliases. Well, okay, great. That's what doesn't give us too much information. And that they were in London or in the UK between Friday the 2nd of March and Sunday the 4th of March. There were particular time bands where the police was interested in their whereabouts, but very little information. Again, as anything that has mystery in it, the whole Bellingcat team immediately jumps on it. And this is what happened immediately after this publication on the Slack, which is the platform that we collaborate on at Bellingcat. Well, basically, I wrote, I wish they would publish their full names as opposed to first and last name. In Russia, well, Russia is a huge country, as you know, and people identify usually with 3 names, with a patronymic in addition to the first and last name, because there are so many combinations, or so few combinations of first and last name, considering that they have very few favorite names. So we started trying to use our typical tool set, EchoSec. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but it was, or it still is, but it was very popular in the early years of the Ukraine war among journalists because we were able to identify particular tweets from or particular posts from a particular location by just putting in the location of where we're looking for. And it would browse through Instagram, Twitter, Flickr, and the Russian social media websites. So we tried to find something, but they hadn't posted anything during their trip to the UK, so that yielded nothing. Then we had the thought we should try to get the passenger manifest of the Aeroflot flight that would have arrived at about the time when the Met Police said that they had arrived in London. Well, as my colleague from Russia, from The Insider, who collaborated on all of these investigations with us, he loves to say, Russia is one of the most transparent societies. And the reason for that is because it's extremely corrupt. It's endemically corrupt. And data from all public databases or from all supposedly private databases is widely available for pennies on the dollar. So essentially, it took us, It's a tool set we had developed in a previous investigation in 2017 when we investigated the artillery shelling of the city of Mariupol, and we were supposed to identify more than 10 undercover Russian officers that commanded that attack. And we developed a certain channel of data sources in Russia. Interestingly, these data sources, data providers, work under the auspices of their own secret services who take a cut from this data trade. So it's very important that we don't identify that we're journalists and that we let these data brokers believe that we are the regular customers. And I can show you an email after our first publication when this whole went and exploded, this whole story exploded, when one of these data providers wrote me an email said, "I'm so disappointed, I thought you were a criminal, you're a journalist, we'll never work with you again." So we have an ethical rule, we only use these data for identifying government agents and spies and not for private individuals. And that rule becomes especially easy to follow when we're talking about fake identities. So the moment there is a non-existent person, the whole data protection law system, universe collapses. And we've been kind of taking some shortcuts around that. Anyway, so we ordered the passenger manifest from one of these data providers. We were expecting the data. The discussion, as you can see, was whether semantically and syntactically these names made sense. Bushirov is a name that was announced, but it doesn't really ring a bell. There's literally no Bushirovs in either Russia or Tajikistan. There are a lot of Bashirovs. So we thought, okay, well, this may really be a fake name. We started looking for alternative data sources. And a lot of media at the same time found that there was an actual account on Facebook of the so-called Ruslan Bushirov. This account had posted only once on October 11, 2014, and there was a photograph from a city that we quickly identified to be Prague. And okay, there was also a Russian account on a sort of second-tier Russian social network called My World, Moy Mir, where there was the same person, Ruslan Bushirov, 40 years old, born in Dushanbe, Tajikistan, who had opened an account to play a game. And again, over a couple of years of investigation, we found out that there's two things that Russian spies can't sort of refrain from. One is posting on Tinder, and the other one is playing games online. And as we found out recently, another weakness in their whole OPSEC universe is that as soon as they give their phone numbers, their secret phone numbers for their undercover identity to their wives ultimately will call them from their real number and create a connection paper trail to their real identities. So these are the three things we've developed over the years as a rule that they haven't changed yet. So this was the only public information about one of them, nothing about the other one. We did an exercise that didn't give us a lot of information, but it's an interesting exercise, and I encourage you to look at it on the Bellingcat website. We used this photo, only this photo that was on the Facebook account, to chronolocate the photo. Chronolocation is the same as geolocation, except in time. So we wanted to find out whether this photograph was really taken on the date or near the date that it was posted on. And if so, we would get the information that Bushirov might have been in Prague at that time, might have given us a clue or another trail of information that we could look after. So we did a very thorough chronolocation. Well, geolocation was easy, but we were able to locate the time of this photograph by the two umbrellas, the yellow and the white umbrella to the left of it. And it's a funny story. I encourage you to look at it if you have time. It's on the website. Okay, so next morning, we got the passenger list of the incoming Aeroflot flight. I yelled to the whole Bellingcat team. And I say, Petrov is in there. Here's his data. Alexander Petrov, passport number, date of birth. There's also Bushirov, Ruslan. They both checked in online at the same time. And that happened to be very late the previous evening, which didn't make a lot of sense. It made a lot of sense, but what didn't make a lot of sense when we found out later is that they bought the tickets at the same time. So essentially they bought their tickets to fly to London for a major operation the night before the operation. Okay, but this was not the most interesting thing here. the most interesting thing here is that if you look at their passport numbers, you will see that they differ only by 3 digits or by 3 numbers at the end. And this was something that was staring at us, and we didn't see it immediately. It took us a couple of hours to see it. So as I wrote at the end here, I said, well, it would be great if it turns out that the passports are fake. We will know that tomorrow. But right as I wrote that, I realized that the passports must be fake or must not be under real names because they follow each other's passport number with 3 digits. Well, the next day, well, actually a couple of days later, Putin called on civilians to come forward, and he called these 2 civilians. Let's just have a quick look at it.
молодыми людьми с фотографией в Англии по поводу дела Скрипалей. То ли они, значит, специально лезли в камеру, чтобы их сфотографировали и был отправлен месседж, это русские, то ли это совсем не профессиональные люди, куда они попали с вашей камеры. Может, просто какая-то третья версия есть?
Мы, конечно, посмотрели, что это за люди. Мы знаем, кто они такие уже, мы их нашли. Ну, надеюсь, что они сами появятся и сами себе расскажут. Это будет лучше для всех. Ну, ничего там особенного и криминального нет, уверяю тебя. Посмотрим в ближайшее время.
Они гражданские?
Гражданские, конечно.
Look at the face of the Chinese president. I mean, he definitely doesn't believe this story. Oh, well, it was a challenge accepted moment. It was such a blatant lie that everybody knew, even the Russian interviewer knew that there's something right here. But what was strange here is that he encouraged them, he instructed them to come forward and speak publicly. And if they hadn't done that, probably we would not have engaged them, because it took me months of working 20 hours a day to identify them. But if he hadn't said that, they wouldn't have gone on television the next day. And I would not have been, we would not have received some of the open source data from that team interview, and I would not have been challenged as much to do that. So I will not play the whole interview that they did on Russia Today, obviously, but just a couple of minutes because...
Это ваши настоящие имена?
Да, наши настоящие имена.
Но вы даже сейчас, когда об этом говорите, вы вот честно выглядите очень напряженными.
А как же вы выглядели? Когда вашу жизнь такой операции перевернули с ног на голову, просто одним днем и сломали. Он знаменит своим штилем 120 он знаменит своими часами, самыми первыми часами, которые были.
Это вы, да?
Да.
Вы, это ваша одежда?
Да.
Вы сейчас в другой одежде?
Да, но она у нас осталась, эта одежда у меня, да, в гардеробе вот эта куртка висит.
Ботинки куплены в Англии.
Параллельно, да, кроссовки Тюбанс. Это вся одежда, это одежда, которая сейчас находит.
Нет, здесь
И она у вас сейчас в России?
Здесь ты ботинки, которые ты купил на Оксфорд-стрит, если не ошибаюсь.
Причем 3 числа.
Потому что когда мы 3-го промокли, да.
Альбомы 3 числа,
в Лондоне
и переобулись, да, пошли, купили себе, я пошел себе, купил обувь. Я был уже на следующем в другой обуви.
Это одежда у вас. Что вы вообще думаете про дело Скрипалей? Кто их отравил? Вы вообще об этом
тяжело сказать,
думаете?
но
До того, как вы видели свои фотографии по телевизору?
Мы в этом живем. Но единственное, что хотелось бы, если реально когда-нибудь отравители найдут, то хотя бы перед нами бы извинились.
Кто отравители?
Даже за то, что...
Выключали.
Даже за то, что мы последние, не знаю, сколько это муссируется уже там, неделю, 5 дней, для меня даже датах потерялся. Что реально просто...
Представить, можете, что произошло вообще с
машину не выйти заправить.
Вы работаете в ГРУ?
А вы работаете в ГРУ?
Я нет, а вы?
Я нет.
Нет.
Okay, it was such a blatant interview that actually I was left with a feeling, well, it's so wrong that maybe it's right, maybe they are innocent and we're all wrong. So actually I was challenged to look and possibly find evidence they're honest individuals, civilians. But the reason I played this is because we were looking for this interview, looking for open source clues. And what would you say was open source evidence that could be used in the investigation in this interview?
Rainy day.
Sorry?
Rainy day.
Rainy day, but yes, but that's something that could be obtained from just a weather channel for that day.
We have no clock on Salisbury Cathedral.
Right, okay, but again, that's something that can be checked in maps. What about them? Can we glean from this? Well, one is obviously the photographs, because the photographs that were published by the Met were blurry and passport photos, and this gave us 100 different angles, which later allowed us to do forensic comparison with other photographs that we found. So we take, I think, 100 different screenshots from this interview, and we used it later, as we will show. There was one other thing that came very handy. We didn't know it was handy, but it came very handy when we identified the third Skripal suspect.
Regional dialects?
Sorry?
Regional dialects?
Actually, yes, absolutely so. The regional dialect of them, which was southern in one case and far eastern or indefined in the other, but absolutely regional dialect is what we used. And the other thing was this. Petrov said, here you're wearing the shoes you bought in Oxford Street. And the reason why they mention names is not because they just blurt out names. They need to create a legend. So we know from prior research that when they mention a name, it's most likely because they were there and they need to create a sort of alibi. And we thought, okay, well, Oxford Street is something we should keep in mind because they're trying to create a cover of shoe shopping at Oxford Street, and something will come up in Oxford Street. What came out later, which I'll talk about more tomorrow, is that the third guy who was trying to not meet with them while he was in London because he was communicating with Center, with Moscow, he took a trip to Oxford Street at about the same time that they were there. So they did have a brush off of some sort at Oxford Street, which would have never known about, or the relevance of that trip of the other guy to Oxford Street would have just been unimportant to us if these guys had not mentioned this. Okay, well, next morning I announced to the channel, breaking, there is no such passport in the Russian national system. Meaning, asks Elliot. Well, a third colleague says, I have no idea why this is significant, but I'm really happy about it. So basically I say it's a fake passport. What does it mean to be that it's a fake passport? Well, what I said is that I found out there are only 4 people in the whole of Russia that had that first and last name and that date of birth. Alexander Petrov, born on the 13th of July 1979. And here are the names of the 4. It's difficult to see them. They have different patronymic names, born on the same day. And what we found out is this is an actual snapshot from his passport file. And this is another thing that you can procure for about €30, but 30 pounds in Russia, from a number of data sources. In this case, it was a cleaning lady working at the Federal Migration Service. And this is a copy of the passport file, sort of his one unitary application for different passports that every person in Russia has. It has the latest passport photo, or one of the latest passport photos, and what we found was something that stood out immediately here. There are odd things in this file. The first thing that was odd was this. It basically said on his form, do not provide information. Okay, well, I've never seen this before in any of the previous research. What does it mean, do not provide information? Then there was another thing. There was a handwritten thing saying there is a letter, or there's a separate letter, depending on how to translate it, and then the abbreviation CC in Russian, or SS in Russian, which actually it deciphers into top secret, okay? And then there was a mysterious number, 1956966, which we couldn't immediately place or identify. So all of these were general clues that there's something very fishy about this person. And in addition, in this file, in this passport file, usually there is a reference to the travel passports, to the foreign travel passports that this person would have. And there was no reference to that travel passport that we found in the passenger manifest. So we knew that this is a person that has a particular reason for his information to be firewalled and protected. Okay, and then something shocked me when I reviewed this file, that this person's existence began in 2009. There were no prior passports issued to this person. There was a reference to a reason for issuing his passport in 2009, which was a unusability of a previous passport, and there was a reference to a previous passport there, but when we checked that passport in the Russian database, it didn't exist. There was no such passport. So basically, we thought at this point we have a story already, and we started talking whether we should team up with the BBC or with anybody else. And basically, I summarized our initial story here in the Red Square. We obtained the passenger manifest of the incoming flight. We saw they bought tickets at 8 p.m. the evening prior. We got their passport numbers, only 3 numbers apart. We obtained all 4 Alexander Petrovs with that birth date that exists in Russia. Only one matched the face at 100%. So the passport numbers suggest that they were created at virtually the same time within minutes of each other. So this was almost enough for an initial story. Then we wanted to find out what's the significance of that number. The first mysterious number, which was looked like a phone number. We checked all kinds of Russian open source databases, including a database of landlines by a Russian company. We found that this number, there was no information about the owner of that number, but it showed us a couple of interesting things. One was that it was licensed to the Ministry of Defense, that number, and it was operating in the area of that little circle there, a street called Zorge, or the headquarters of the telephone exchange was at Zorge Street number 3. Well, Zorge Street is named after Richard Zorge, the famous the German double agent spy who helped the Soviets during the Second World War. But that's not good enough to allude to a GRU connection here. However, what is interesting is that Zorge Street number 3 is about 300 meters from the headquarters of the GRU. So we thought, okay, well, there is more and more evidence that this might be a GRU-linked number. What we did was a colleague, this investigation, this serious investigation was extremely unusual because every time we published something, and we published it in bits and pieces, we didn't do one thorough story. We did it with, in a sequence of 7 different stories as we found new significant information. It allowed other media to jump on board and start looking for independently, both to validate our data or disvalidate it, or to add to it. So in this particular case, Novaya Gazeta from Russia just thought of the most obvious thing, to call that number and to see if it's a real number. They called the number, and the person on the other line said, yes. Are you the Ministry of Defense? Yes. What part of the Ministry of Defense are you? Okay. And he hung up, yeah? And then after that, somebody else called, I think the Associated Press called, and then a person answered and said it was the flea market of Moscow, okay? Yeah. So, and then since then that number was disconnected. This is a part of the multi-level gaming that I spoke about. What's the other mysterious number? Well, it's their passport numbers. What we found out was, what I remember that I had worked on another GRU officer identification almost a year before. It was somebody involved in the Montenegro failed coup. That was ultimately indicted by the Montenegro government a couple of months ago. And I thought of checking his passport number, which was widely available because it was posted on the Interpol wanted list a year earlier. And that person I had proved, and we had proved in our publication, was a GRU officer. So I got teary-eyed when I saw that the difference between between these two guys and that guy, who's a proven GRU spy, was only 27 numbers, yes? So there's no way that this can be an accident. There's absolutely no way that these are random coincidences. So this validated the GRU link for the two. That was enough to break a story for us. Basically, the story was, we've confirmed Bushirov and Petrov are fake cover identities, so the British government didn't lie about it, it's true. And confirmed, they have links not just to an intelligence service, but to the GRU, which is what the British government had not volunteered this information. And then we were able to publish their prior travel itinerary, because we thought it would be interesting for other journalists around the world to look at what they were doing in their respective countries. And that showed a very intensive travel under fake identities to London, Paris, Geneva, Frankfurt, Amsterdam, Tel Aviv, and as we later found out, this was only in the last 3 years, and we found out they had traveled literally, globe-trotted the world in the years before that. Okay, so, but then we came to a new challenge, which was, now that we know that these are GRU officers and we have their fake identities, can we find the real people behind these fake identities? And that was the second level of the game, because by that time, Russia started cleansing some of the information. We tried reverse searching images to find if there's anybody on social media and so on and so forth. One of the best reverse image search engines in the world is not Google Images, by far not. Even Bing is better at that. But the best one is Yandex, the Russian search engine, the equivalent of Google. They're about 100 times better than Google. But we didn't find anyone matching these faces, so that was that cul-de-sac. We found out that they had addresses in their Russian passport files. They had addresses that exist, not fake addresses. But when we contacted these addresses, the people who lived there, they were either namesakes that had never heard of these people, or in one case, in the case of Boshirov, it was an old granny who lived at that address. And as we approached her, she said, "Oh yeah, great, I have no idea who he is, but I have about 10 traffic fines received to this address for him. So if you do talk to him, can you hand these over to him?" So we thanked, yes, sure, thanks. So that was good because we got his driver's license number through the fines from the old lady. Okay, there were no telephone numbers registered to these two suspects, which we suspected was that they had been cleansed from the telephone databases. So we decided to take a completely different approach. Rather than search for matches of faces to clearly hidden identities that have been cleansed from the system, why don't we take a deductive approach? And then we started wondering, where would such elite spies that travel abroad, that have businesses, fake businesses, that have fooled even the British Foreign Office that gave them visas, multiple visas, to travel to the UK. Where would such elite spies who have gone to school? And let's start with that school provenance. We spoke to a couple of Russian former officers, some of them living in London, security officers. One of them said, well, there were only 2 elite schools that would have operated at about the time that they graduated, yeah, because based on their age, they would have graduated around the turn of the century. One of them was the Far Eastern Military Academy, abbreviated as DVOKU. And the other one was the Frunze Academy, but it was for older people. So age estimate of the graduation was between 2001 and 2003, based on their age. And then we went to thousands of photographs at the graduation and general yearbooks of this main school. And then we found somebody who looked a little bit like him. Yeah? After looking through thousands of photographs, we found a possible match in an undated photo titled "Alumni of the School on Assignment in Chechnya." We asked some former Russian officers to tell us what year does this look like, uniform-wise and background-wise. They estimated it to be about 2003, 2005, which would coincide with the Second Chechen War. And the story under this picture referred to alumni of our school, including Heroes of Russia. Okay, well, that was interesting because Heroes of Russia is a very limited number of people. And then there was... Then we looked on Google for the combination of DVOKU, Hero of Russia, and Chechnya. One of the top entries we got was in a newspaper called the Far Eastern Volunteer Union, a story from 2016 which referred to a certain Colonel Anatoly Chepiga. And basically the story was little snippets, said one can become a hero even in our peaceful time. The person born in the village of Nikolaevka, who graduated at DVOKU school in 2001, Chepiga, 3 times assigned to Chechnya, has more than 20 awards and recognitions. And in December 2014, Colonel Chepiga received the Hero of Russia Award for performing peacekeeping missions. Okay, well, what peacekeeping missions would have existed in December 2014? We assumed, and the only logical explanation was that he must have been involved in an undercover mission in Ukraine, because that was the only war at that time that Russia was peacekeeping. No photographs for this person online, and this was a major clue, because if there is a Hero of Russia, you'd not only expect, you always get hundreds of public showings, of award ceremonies. Going back to his school to talk about it, there were a lot of like 4 or 5 references to him visiting his school in Nikolaevka in the Far East, or talking at different events, but never a photograph. And this gave us a working hypothesis: maybe this is Bushirov, because there was a vague resemblance in that photograph. And this is a guy that clearly is top secret, because they're hiding him. There was no reference to actual award ceremony for this Hero of Russia Award on the Kremlin page. Usually there is. In this case, it was kept secret. So then we started looking for that person called Anatoly Chepiga. We found him listed in a leaked 2003 residential database, of which there are thousands of freely available, freely downloadable Russian aged databases. Via torrents, you can download them for nothing, for zero. And we found the following. We found that he was referenced as residing at the military unit 20662 in the far eastern town of, or city of Khabarovsk. Well, that military unit was a Spetsnaz, therefore GRU military unit, and it would make sense for somebody who was assigned to such a Spetsnaz unit to later be assigned to Moscow, to the GRU headquarters at some point if he excels. So then we found the same person in a Moscow database, 2013, 10 years later, same name, same date of birth, and we needed a photograph to actually be sure that this is the same person. Well, how do you search for a Hero of Russia? Well, we went to the monument near the school of Dvoku, and that monument is essentially on the right-hand side, has a list of all of the graduates, all of the alumni who received the award. And you see there are not that many. And the last one added there at some point in 2015, because we checked photographs of this that were posted in public forum, we checked each of the photographs, and we found out that the first time this name appeared was in February 2015. And then it took us a week of sort of outsourcing our work to a lot of media and bloggers around the world. We started looking for photographs of the inside of that school, which was off limits to us. We were not allowed to enter, because we knew that there was a wall of fame in that school. And we wanted to get a clear shot of who's there, and maybe there would be a photograph of our guy. And we ultimately got a video. We found a video posted on the Russian equivalent of Facebook on VK in 2015. And this is an alumnus going around the corridors of the school and taking sort of videos as he goes. And we took a screenshot of that. We found somebody who was Chepiga, and using a photograph from the actual interview, we were able to match him with significant confidence that that's the same guy. But then, knowing that we are almost sure that's the same guy, we invested in obtaining his passport file under the real name, and that gave us a complete match. We did a forensic analysis of the faces, and we found that that's the real that is Chepiga. We confirmed our hypothesis. We dispatched a reporter to his home village, and we got confirmation from his neighbors. Now, another thing that never changes is all of these spies traditionally come from tiny villages and in far-flung corners of Russia. One of the reasons apparently is because it's an upward social elevator for them, but the other reason is that this decreases the chance of them stumbling across somebody they know when they're on a mission. But this also makes it very easy when we visit one of these villages to find a babushka who will say, yes, we're so proud, he's a spy. And this happened every single time. In one case, a babushka in the street said, yes, and this was the case with Petrov, yes, there's actually a photograph that his grandmother has of him getting a award from Putin, but she doesn't allow us to touch it, so she just allows us to see it from her hands. So they were so proud, and they gave us all the information. Identifying Petrov was much harder because by that time we had published the Chepiga story, and Russia had cleansed the passport database, the real-time passport database, of the actual passport files of their spies. So this was level 3. We had to work without being able to get actual access to the passport database. The eureka moment for him was came from the Telegraph, who mentioned that they found out from a source at MI5 that the first name coincides with the last name, with the fake name. So the real person's first name is also Alexander, as in the Alexander Petrov case. And that rang a bell for me, and I thought, well, let's go back to that guy, whose name was, I had identified in the Montenegro case. He had operated under the fake name Eduard Shirokov, but we found out that his real name was Eduard Chishmakov. The middle name, the patronymic, was almost the same, Vladimirovich and Vadimovich, and he was born in the same place in both identities. So this gave us a sort of a pattern of how they might be operating as well. So we said, well, let's take this as an algorithm and let's try if something comes out for Petrov with this. So we reversed engineered this algorithm, and we started looking for first name Alexander, birthday July 30th, 1709, and location, because you can't just do that, you would get probably 10,000 names in Russia. We had to limit it to a location. And like in this reference in his fake passport file, it referred to St. Petersburg as issue of his first passport. We decided that there may be also, for whatever reason, a vestige of his real identity here. So we limited our search to St. Petersburg. And we found only one Alexander from St. Petersburg that matched this identity, and it was Alexander Yevgenievich, and this was the second red light. Yevgenievich was also his middle patronymic name in his fake identity. And the third name was Mishkin. Okay, this made some sense to us because, as in the case with the other jury officer, we found out that the reason why they retain as much as possible, usually, of their original identities is because if they get drunk and they need to remember, and they need to at least remember enough to not confuse it, but also because if they're met by an old relative or an old schoolmate in the street, in Russia they would usually address them with the first name and patronymic. And if they're in a covert environment talking to officers of another country, they don't want to be addressed by the wrong name. But this approach would make sure that they're always addressed with the right first and patronymic name. Well, anyway, so we found that there was such a person in St. Petersburg with this combination of first, middle name, and date of birth. We identified some interesting things about him, and one was that we found this person in a database, a residential database in St. Petersburg, and we found that he lived for several years in a communal building, in a sort of what they call in Russia a kommunalная kvartira, with sharing an apartment with about 8 people. We looked at each of these 8 people, and we found out that many of them were medical students or medical graduates today. And we could find their medical profession postings and so on and so forth. So we thought, okay, where is that place? And we found out to be exactly across the street from the St. Petersburg Military Medical Academy. So that narrowed us to a hypothesis that maybe this guy is, in fact, a Russian medical military doctor. We approached more than 200 graduates of the Russian Military Medical Academy in St. Petersburg via the Russian Facebook equivalents. And we asked them if they knew of such a person, if they had seen this face, and so on and so forth. Most of them immediately responded, no, we've never heard of such a person, and snubbed us. One of them, however, said off the record that yes, he does remember such a person, and that he had been asked, or he had been approached by the FSB to warn him, as all graduates apparently were, that they might be approached by media and they should say nothing. So we got an actual off-the-record confirmation from one of more than 200 people that we called or contacted, who told us that he knows this person. Okay, well then we started looking for an equivalent of this person in Moscow, and we found out something extremely interesting. We found a record of a car, a Volvo that he had. We took the records from public sources, completely official public sources of this car, cost €3. And we found out that this car had been registered before that in St. Petersburg, and now had been moved to an address near the GRU headquarters in Moscow. Okay, so that was another interesting, well, not near. As you can see in this at the bottom is the registered address of the car of Mishkin, and it is registered literally at Khoroshevskoye Chaussee 76. This is the headquarters of the GRU. So by that time we had already the complete conviction that we had identified him and that this was Petrov, the equivalent of Petrov, and that they're both GRU. Then the problem was that they had deleted his passport data from his passport file, because at that time they knew what we were doing. So we thought laterally, well, who might have a passport, a copy of his passport? And then we essentially contacted, we traced the car registrations, and we found out when he had sold cars and when he had bought cars, and when he had obtained insurances for that car. And we were able to approach an insurance agent who had signed off on one of his insurances. And the guy completely free of charge, as a whistleblower, provided us with the paperwork for that car transaction. And that contained an actual copy of his passport, which we didn't publish in full. You're seeing it here, but we haven't published it, only the photograph we published. But it allowed us to take a comparison of the faces of this versus the passport file of Mishkin, the passport file of Petrov, versus the face on the RT interview, and we obtained a forensic match of the faces. When I refer to forensic matches of the faces, I want to thank a professor at the University of Bradford who has completely free of charge helped us with all of the forensic face analysis, and I recommend him to anybody that might want to do that as well. What he has developed is a age regression and simulation technology, which is unique, and it allows faces to be compared across many, many decades of aging, and in some cases he has even been able to compare a child's face to a father's face and give us a significant confidence level. Obviously we would never publish something like that, but for us to understand the probability and the plausibility of this being the same person has been very helpful. So I'll be happy to share the contacts with anybody who's interested in that type of research. And bottom line is what we found out is ultimately he was born in Loiga, a village of 400 people in Arkhangelsk, Northern European Russia, graduated from the Military Medical Academy in St. Petersburg in 2003, specialized in deep underwater submarine physiology, was recruited by the GRU around or just before 2003, moved to Moscow under a new identity at around 2009, or at least that's the first time we found him in the records. And we identified that in 2011 to 2013, he was involved in undercover operations in Ukraine and Transnistria. And the latest official visit to Ukraine was in December 2013. How were we able to identify this last bit? Another leaked database that is freely downloadable. It contains all airline bookings of Russian citizens from the period 2011 to 2016. Again, available as a torrent. Very, very helpful, because what we have been able to do is not only identify some of these GRU spies flying to different locations, but also have been able to check for other matching people who bought the ticket at the same time, because the database has also the time of purchase, checked in at the same time, and traveled to the same destination, which gives us an idea of joint bookings of people who travel together. So starting with the 3 people or 2 people that we initially identified plus the Montenegro guy, and applying this approach, we were able to expand our universe of proven GRU spies with international footprint to about 25 by now. Participated military operations in eastern Ukraine. Well, this was the one thing we didn't get from data and open sources. We got it from the grandmother who said that he received the award for that, for operations in Ukraine. And he received in the autumn of 2014 a Hero of the Russian Federation. Another thing that kind of validated this information about the Hero of the Russian Federation for both of them, which we only received in one case from an open source and in the other case from a babushka, was, and we wanted to get as much as possible from open sources, we obtained their residential records and ownership records under their real identities. And we found out that both of them had received from the state, received for free, huge apartments from Moscow standards, costing in the range of between €500,000 to €600 in early 2015. And they had moved from their dormitories, where they lived with their families, at the GRU headquarters, to brand new flashy apartments that no Russian soldier or even military doctor could afford. And we hypothesized, and that's the only explanation, that this was sort of an award in kind for that went along with their Hero of Russia name badge. Well, that's how we did these two guys. Then we did some follow-up identifications. As I said, we expanded it to a group of 24 elite jury officers using the passport number range, and/or companion travelers from that leaked database that I mentioned. We identified the third Skripal suspect, who traveled a day earlier and left on the same day, but a couple of hours earlier. We identified him also by the passport range, and then we did a lot more on him, which I'll share tomorrow, because it turns out he's a much, much bigger fish than they are. And we also were able to link the two jury officers from this investigation to a Bulgarian poisoning of an arms dealer in 2015, who happened to have been selling to the wrong countries. He was selling to Syrian rebels. And they tried to poison him using something that very much resembles Novichok, but most likely is a different version of a hard-to-trace poison. He survived, but he was in a coma for about two months. And the work continues. And I'll speak about some of the extra work tomorrow at the 11:30, I think, lecture. So that's it from me, and I'd be happy to answer any questions or give you any tips to data sources that might be of interest to you.